Heidegger repeatedly emphasizing the calculative nature of Nietzsche's pursuit. He says that Nietzsche, like the tradition, takes the human being to be a psychosomatic being that uses the help of logic and intellect and also instinct to its ends. There's in the beginning of section 2 of the Use and Abuse of History, Nietzsche says his goal is happiness, not perhaps his own, but often the nation's or humanity's at large. He avoids Quietism. There's two things that are notable there. One, this older sense that you see in, I would say, if you read Spengler, what Spengler says about, I think he speaks specifically about Raskolnikov, but about the Russians in general. And Dugin brings this out in his arguments with Fukuyama. The nature of somebody who, in their being, is more likely to be like this man that Nietzsche speaks of here, that his goal is happiness, not perhaps his own, but often the nation or humanity's at large. I think that's a much less likely of a goal for someone in, perhaps also I would say in current Germany just as much as the rest of the Western countries, because of the great feeling of the individual, the necessity of individual struggle for livelihood and so forth. But the very naturalness of that one would be fortified and feel fulfilled in the sense of Raskolnikov, who commits a crime for the sake of the narod, let's say, for the folk, for the people. But the other part that I want to go more into is this issue of the he avoids Quietism. So how far can we identify the Quietism with the releasement, the letting be, so-called, this Gelassenheit, or Gelassenheit. We have all these. By the way, if somebody wants to look at somebody who knows the German language better than I do, my Deutsch is Sauschlecht, but it's like a Sau, but Sau bad. But I've noticed that there's this group of Heideggerians, let's call them, Pravis Emad, I think his name is Ivo Di Gennaro, and Johannes Niederhauser. They have been making quite a bit about etymologies and word usages. So I have an error that I need to correct in connection to it, but it brings us in a way in connection to all this thing, is that it's true that Nietzsche says Historia in his title and in his main concepts he brings out here, the monumental history, antiquarian, Criticien, Historia. He uses that, but in the text, although he does use Historia much more frequently, he does speak of Geschichte quite a bit too. At the end of section 2, I was looking at the actual usage. He says, he starts by saying history regarded as pure knowledge, and there he says die Geschichte als reine Wissenschaft. So it's like it reminds of the Kant's title of reine Vernunft, the pure reason, but here the pure Wissenschaft, pure science, die Geschichte, so the history regarded as pure knowledge or pure science. But then just a little while further, he speaks of die historische Bildung, the historical study. Just a little further down in the same paragraph, historical power, unhistorisch Macht. So I leave it to somebody else to decide whether he's variegating for the sake of style or whether this has some content. It's hard to discern. The question of the mysticism, for instance, in this question of quietism. So quietism, where he says this, under Heidegger's understanding, this is one who's using history and for calculative uses, and Nietzsche says he avoids quietism. So if you look at the country path conversation, they say there's a talk of not renouncing willing, but renouncing the will. And so that's certainly here Nietzsche's willing the use of history for life, this calculative use of history for life. He's not allowing the releasement. Another question is, where so far is how are we to understand Heidegger's question of the calculative? He speaks of the Greeks as their understanding as being fundamentally the understanding of logic as being calculative. But there's a question of whether logic includes also nous. So in the Greeks, especially in Plato and Aristotle, the whole subject matter of when we say the Greeks is much larger. I know there's scores of other thinkers we could bring in actually in the time, let's say, for the hundreds of years after Plato and Aristotle, when the Academy and the Peripatetics and the Stoa and all these other schools were active. There's all kinds of thinkers that people, others are much more knowledgeable than me, but in Plato and Aristotle, there's a difficulty that in the higher part of the Suke, or in the Greek psychology, in the higher part, in the logos part, you have the lower parts, the sort of the honor-seeking part, the appetitive, and the lower appetitive part. But in the higher part, there's a division between episteme, the lower part, which is associated with mathematics and calculation more clearly. But calculation, of course, here Heidegger means relying on things to, he means more like logistics, being able to get things done, being able to treat things as something we can reliably use to bring about a task, such as, and in that sense you can see how history has a science is then there, or history as something that we can hold in our hands and use logistically to increase life is calculative. But there's also a higher part of the, let's say the logos, the top third of the soul, and that's the nous part, and nous is more connected with the ideas and with the pure onlooking, with the activity of the theorist. So there's some subtleties in that. The greater subtlety, I think, in this case is where exactly is the will to be located. And so then we have this difficulty of what does the will mean. There's willing of just setting ourselves towards a task, but there's also willing in the sense of the Kantianism, which comes in also to even into a more subtle form in Brentano and Husserl in the intentionality. So I have the representation in Kant. This is supposed to be the meaning of the idealism in Kant is that the human being is an active force. So our understanding that I apprehend something, a tree, for instance, this is passive in the tradition, understood in the Aristotelian way or in the Thomistic way, it's passive. But in the Kantian way, the representing to ourselves of a tree is an act of the mind in order to is something active. So in understanding the world, this is a kind of act of will. So it's unlike the usual way we talk about willing. We think of ourselves as having some plan, something we want to do, but our very intelligibility of things, standing before a tree, that's the proper representation of a tree to ourselves when we are actually standing before the tree rather than thinking about it or so forth. But that is a kind of activity thought in the Kantian way. So in a way, so this is pointing towards the way that we can think of not being in releasement. We're grasping things. We're actively making them intelligible to ourselves. I wanted to try to ask about one thing. How are we to distinguish mysticism in general from the Gelassenheit, from the letting be, which seems to mean not just stopping willing, but stepping out of the will entirely. What is the peculiarity of the Heideggerian approach, which claims to be the culmination of the Western history as such? So let's keep with that.